Hello, everyone. My name is Nana Hovhannisyan, and today I will moderate the emergence of governmental systems and structures over time webinar, which is within the framework of the International Coaching Week happening all around the world, including Armenia, from May 17th to May 23rd. This is a week-long global celebration that educates the public around about the value of coaching. And thank you for joining us today. This is the second day already. And we have a special guest, Christopher Cooke. Thank you, Christopher, for joining us. I know that you are traveling now, and thanks for finding time for this webinar.
Thank you, Nana.
Today's topic is even bigger than coaching, and it's our honor to have you here as a guest speaker. Before we start our webinar, let me introduce our guest speaker. So, Christopher is recognized not only for coaching, he's also a managing director of 5D Limited, international specialist provision of comprehensive systemic change management and innovation support for individuals and organizations. He's a strategist and educator. He's a UK director at the Howard Law Institute. And he has also developed a full spectrum emergence framework, which is developed in partnership with Ericsson Coaching International. And one of the things that strike me most is that Christopher is an engineer by first education. So as I mentioned before, the topic of the webinar is the emergence of governmental systems and structures over time, which is basically an essential topic, especially for Armenia now. And of course, Christopher, my interest is about Armenia. And as you know, we're going through crisis situation in my country, especially after Artsakh war. So taken the full spectrum emergency framework and the topic that you're presenting, what are the ways for the breakthrough for Armenia?
Is that my first question?
I would suggest to keep that in focus probably for us, not for you, while having your presentation. And yeah, hopefully we will come back to that one by the end of the presentation.
Okay. So would you like me to start?
Yeah.
So thank you, Nana. It's a privilege to be here, and I'm sat in the UK. I'm looking out of a window. I'm in a very tall house in the countryside, and if I look hard enough, I can see right the way across the world to Mount Ararat, and I get the sense that Mount Ararat is calling us in many ways. Okay. So if there was a subtitle to my talk today, it is that Mount Ararat is calling. So even though I'm going to offer you my view of the emergence of governmental systems and structures over time, I really want to offer it at a time and in a spirit that reflects the need for significant new thinking in the way we run our societies. And many of us have a sense of the need for peace, no one will deny that, and a sense of the need for freedom. And hopefully by the time we get to the end of what I'm going to offer, it will raise more questions than you have at the moment, but lead to distinctions in the conversation that you did not have before I started. So as Nana said, I'm an engineer by background, and I became curious in the large-scale privatization of the water industry in the UK about what was really possible when you work with people. And that became the basis of my life. So from about 1997 until now, I've lived an experiment where I've set out deliberately to discover what's possible. And that means that I'm focused very much on large-scale human change, and I specialize in what today would be called integral theory. And as Nana said, I've been developing a lineage that started in the 1950s from the work of Claire W. Graves. It later became known as spiral dynamics, and then spiral dynamics integral. And now in the beginning of the 2020s, I call it full spectrum emergence. And we continue the research and the application, and day by day, week by week, it's proving itself to be very successful. And what happened to me in the late 90s was that I began to be involved with very large scale change issues when things fell over that wouldn't work. So for example, I was involved with the collapse of medical schools, or when organizations or regions in the world ran into drought situations, and organizations in stress or in trauma, the 30-year drought in Australia and so on. And that really led me to do what I do today, which I describe as the scope is from the soil to the stomach to the soul. So the project I'm here on in the UK this week is focused on ecological work and the recovery of soil. Excuse me, I thought my phone was switched off. And that's what leads me to the fourth bullet point on the slide here, that we actually demonstrate our work through very large scale application in agriculture, not only here in the UK, but in Ireland, the Republic of Ireland, and around the world. And for anyone who's struggling from a water shortage, or issues around quality of food, or understanding what's the basis of all wealth on our planet, I assure you we need to revisit our conversation on soil. And also, seeing Charlotte in my arms reminds me to let you know that I'm married, I'm a granddad, and I've never been happier, and actually never been more inspired to do what I do, because I have the future of these young children, not only my own grandchildren in mind, but your children and our grandchildren. And today is a very critical time for us to pursue that work. Now, the identity that I've operated under since 1997 is a story. And the story, the shorthand, is 5 deep. And this is the basis around which I want to build up the conversation with you today, because I want to offer you some insights into human change that lead to governmental systems on the surface. I want to turn our whole conversation on its head. So the story of 5 deep is this: that when we look out into the world, on the surface, we see people behaving and acting in certain ways, and we see them influenced by certain systems and structures and artifacts that are shaped and created by individuals who think in certain ways, their mindset. And these mindsets, and I'm talking there about individual values and beliefs and collective ideals and norms, are what shape the nature of our systems and structures and influence our behaviors. But mindset, there's a deeper story to it, and that's the area I've focused on since the early 80s. And behind the mindset are what today we understand as complex adaptive intelligences, systems within us, coping systems, that enable us to adapt and change over the long run of time. And so the internal and external life conditions, the time, the place, the problems and the circumstances. So for example, in 2021, in many places around the world, there are big problems with water, and there are big problems with agriculture. Many mass migrations of people are caused because they cannot feed themselves. And those stimulate human creativity. They stimulate our ability to adapt in many, many ways that leads to ultimately the behaviors and actions that you often see today. And so on the surface, around drought and shortage of water, apparently that's the root cause, are mass migration of people, are agencies striving to provide aid, individuals who are dislocated from their homelands, and that tends to lead to conflict. And above all else around the world, we see the big question about climate change, because ultimately all these issues that we're facing today mesh together into the new collective narrative that we need to learn to navigate through. So my conversation with you today starts in these lower two levels, because it's from these complex adaptive intelligences and our response to the world around us that leads us to begin to understand how to respond to our political, social, ecological issues that we are facing today. Now, this little model is designed for some coaches, the coaches that are listening in, but for anyone in a leadership position. Doesn't matter what your role in society is. It's basically saying that we each have these different perspectives, these glasses with various colored lenses, and I've just shown the multiple range of colors here that indicates filters, and each filter only allows in the information that the individual at a deep level really wants to see. And it filters out things that the individual can't comprehend or does not want to consider. So these perspectives influence and shape all that we do, and it filters our memories, our values, and our beliefs, and even alters our physiology. So our biological, neurochemical dynamics are influenced by how we receive information from the world around us. And ultimately, that all leads to our particular behavior. Now, the two things I'd like you to hold on to, the two statements I'd like to hold on to in this part of the presentation is this, that the eye can only see what the mind can comprehend. That's a very interesting statement. It means that if you come across something that you've never seen before, you've really no ability to make sense of the new, and therefore sometimes it can be a struggle. And second, and most importantly, that the mind can only comprehend what its coping systems allow. So what we're going to look at today when we look at governmental systems, that governmental systems are reflections of how we think. And if how we think has a range of themes, that means that if we look into governance and governance systems, we'll find those themes revealing themselves. And if we understand that each of those coping systems has different ways of handling complexity, that means that we have a whole new way of bringing what I would call a full spectrum awareness to that we believe to be familiar and true. So from the coaching point of view, and in the spirit of the ICF celebration this week, my conversation, my talk with you is really about fundamental reframing our context and meaning around everything that we see and imagine. Now, there's very strong science behind this, which I won't go into in too much detail, but we're dealing with leading edge science here around the understanding of the complex adaptive systems within us that equip us to thrive and change. And this dance between our psychological spaces and the place, the time, and the context in which we find ourselves have become well mapped over the last 70 years. And so we understand the patterns of how mindsets change in relation to specific sets of life conditions. So today, it doesn't matter where you're listening to me from, it's Armenia, the life conditions Armenia will carry a full spectrum of awarenesses that are responding in many different ways to the life conditions in which every Armenian finds themselves. Obviously, in the UK, I'm responding to a situation around Brexit and all the changes due to COVID-19, all these issues that we're all dealing with at the moment. Now, what is true is that we can look back down the comet's tail of history and see how there have been significant changes in our species, different periods when different expressions, different ways of organizing ourselves have appeared. And we can see that the ages, and this little diagram goes back about 3 million years. It should be saying 3000 BC is an interesting time scale. What we can see is that the human species in humanoid form has been around for about 2.5 million years. And then we see that we developed different skills, the use of fire, agriculture about 10,000 years ago, the invention of writing, the fall of the Roman Empire, so 2,000 years ago it was created, Columbus discovered America in the 15th century, and so on and so forth. And we can see that each age has changed it's been created, born, reached a peak, and then disappeared. And very often, as the French Revolution sign here reminds me, it's very often a time when the end or the transition is supported by conflict and tension that leads to significant change. The spirit in which I want to talk about governance today and governmental systems and how they change is in the context of a phrase that came out in the early 1970s, and this conversation around wicked problems, things that we need to deal with in our everyday and global existence. But we now know that conventional thinking struggles to cope with the complexity, and we need new sciences, new ways of thinking about this. And the wicked problem means is that there's no conventionally minded clear solution. Now, in the research and in the activities I've been involved with, and certainly this document that's quoted here on the right-hand side of the slide came out of Australia in 2007. And it said clearly that the handling of wicked problems requires holistic rather than linear thinking. So linking to everything I've said today, what this is saying is that there's new mindsets, the release and utilization of new intelligences within us that have been emerging and rising, if only we could learn how to use them. And there is a danger that we don't allow this new thinking to emerge. And it says here, this is a quote directly from this report from 2007 in Australia, that there's an ever-present danger in handling wicked issues in that they are handled too narrowly. Now, what that means from a governance point of view is you try to apply what you believe to be tried and tested to handle issues of today's complexity. And we're discovering that in many contexts that the way we know how to handle things isn't working anymore. So it's time for some new thinking. Looking back in from space, for example, if we didn't know that humanity existed, we'd ask the question, this species on Earth seems to be doing something significant. Perhaps we can identify them as a desert-making species. So these brown areas are highlighting the areas in which greenness is disappearing through our agricultural practices. Largely, we're turning healthy, vibrant land into desert areas. It's one of the greatest challenges we face on the planet at the moment. And obviously, as the land is stripped of its green growing plants, that changes the whole way in which heat and the hydrology of the planet functions, and it tends to show up in the news as a conversation around global warming and climate change. But the root cause, what's the root cause? It's very simple at one level. It's all down to the decisions that I take, you take, and how we choose to govern. So one of the key messages I'd like you to take from today is that governance systems change and have changed over time because they had to develop new ways of thinking when the old ways could not cope with the complexity. Now, this has been studied quite extensively, and the book Collapse by Jared Diamond highlights why some societies or organizations do make disastrous decisions and very often disappear. Yes, societies disappear. In fact, civilizations do disappear. Over the last 10 or 20,000 years, about 20 civilizations have disappeared. And if you read the book by Jared, it basically is a hard read, because basically what it's saying is that every civilization failed and disappeared because it could not feed itself. Now you understand why I'm focused on agriculture. But the 6 reasons that Jared Diamond highlighted, and I want to then offer you my antidotes to these issues. So failure to anticipate a problem. Well, turning a blind eye to climate change, turning a blind eye to the way in which we handle our ecology, our culture, and our social systems, and failing to listen to the stories from the edges, from those individuals who can sense the problems. That's a big problem, because very often the problem becomes a crisis because of our failure to anticipate that which is naturally next. So beyond desertification, for example, is a significant change in the climatic patterns on the planet. We can anticipate that. Many scientists around the world are foretelling that. But are we responding quickly enough? The second one is the failure to perceive. The failure to perceive is a problem at all. It's irrelevant. How could we influence the planet? It's only in the last 5 to 10 years that we began to realize actually that the human species, humanity, can shape the future of our climate. It was literally thought to be too big of an issue. So failure to perceive, failure to be able to comprehend the issue or the root cause of what's going on. Rational bad behavior, great example, I'm looking out of the window here. Even though we know that the extensive use of agrochemicals causes problems with human health, causes problems with the ecological health, causes problems in the way that our local habitats are losing biodiversity, yet I'm looking out of this window here and there is bad behavior going on. Why? Because without using the chemicals, they would go out of business. That's rational bad behavior. Disastrous values means that things that I believe to be true and important to me actually are at odds with the very future of the way forward. So values are those things that are important to us. Ideals that are those things that we collectively come together that we believe to be important to us. So a disastrous ideal may well be that actually our economy is the most important thing, and it doesn't matter what else happens to us, we have to protect our economy, even though our ecology may well be declining. So anytime that we choose to rationalize and offer an excuse because fear of shame, fear of blame, fear of not being good enough, fear of loneliness, those are other irrational reasons why we tend to see failures at the very large scale. So a good example from the book by Jared Diamond is the Norse basically starved to death because they believed fervently that their culture did not eat fish. The archaeologists discovered that they ate every pet and every animal they had. They ate the farm animals first and were even down to eating the pets. But the one thing that they did not do was eat fish, which ironically was in the ocean that they lived next to for many, many generations. Number 6, unsuccessful solutions. I do what I do because I'm only interested in stuff that works. And it's amazing how many times I come across individuals coming out with new ideas, new solutions that we can predict won't work. But we have to, at times, just sit back and watch whilst they discover that what they were doing was not the success that they thought. So unsuccessful solutions are the sixth reason. So hold on to these 6 thought processes as we go further into the conversation, because I want to show you how each of these characteristics links to our inability to cope in a given situation, and therefore our inability to learn and be open to the change that we so desperately need, even though, paradoxically, by the time you and I come to have this conversation today about this, the change has already happened and we're just learning to grow into it. The change has already happened and we're just learning to grow into it. Anyone who's listening to this conversation is looking for a better way forward. And what I'm saying from a change management point of view is significant, that very often the answer is already within us. We just need to, like a genie's lamp, release that capability. So when I look back at history and I look at the changes in our species and the changes in the way our cultures have emerged, I'm talking about really the underlying change being a creative flow of worldviews. And I just need to give you some glimpse of this so you can really grasp what I'm talking about when I talk about changes in governance. Now, we've spoken about the life conditions, things that are occurring on the surface. And I've hinted at there is an increase in fragility of planet and species, whatever scientific metric you use to on biodiversity, health, and so on and so forth, it's becoming increasingly fragile. But just like I did on my slide when I focused on the 5 deep conversation, I want to look at these complex adaptive intelligences that I'm going to call worldviews in the presentation from now on, and just look at how they've changed and are changing, and basically become the means by which we handle the complexity. On here is the evidence, the clear evidence of why in Australia, after the 30-year drought, the big conversation was moving to the need for more holistically oriented thinking. Now, these worldviews we can present as a flow. The top half of the image is a reflecting a flow through the flow form sculpture. Each bowl of water has its own pattern, and there is an overall linear flow that runs through. But I want you to focus on two things. One, the image of flow, this flow and the gap in the center. I want you to be aware of that. But I also want you to just soak up the images that are shown at the bottom. Just look at these images and then look at the words. So in the beige, the survival band, instinct driven. So we're starting to look at the organizing patterns, the codes and principles of the range of worldviews that we now understand exist on the planet. And we know we're not finished as a species. So this is just the first 8 that we know about. There are others that are emerging, but we've not yet got sufficient confidence to produce reliable information on that. So the survival band was transcended and included by the tribal order. So 120,000 years ago on the planet, the survival band, very instinct driven, was the only way of thinking available to our species. About 40,000 years ago, a big shift, possibly following a series of a significant ice age period, a tribal order, safety driven, where the strong surround and protect the weak, and you have the characteristic of being able to organize and govern up to about 350 people. In the first, it's about 12 to 15. And then we have the emergence of the Trojan empires and the other stories of great feats. The exploitive empire, power-driven, about 10,000 years ago. That capacity emerged within our species to leave behind the stories of the Trojans and the Roman Empire and so on and so forth. That's the domain of the empires. About 5,000 years ago, another shift, the authority structure, order-driven, the basis of all monotheistic religions, the one God, the one true right way, ordered. In red, it's the story of the many gods. In purple, it's the story of the spirits and the ancestors. In orange, we have scientism becomes the revered power that's greater than self, in the strategic enterprise and the success-driven energy of a very enterprising self, emerged about 800 years ago in our species. In the last 200 years, we started to see the emergence of a more humanistic way of engaging each other, the social network, people-driven. Now notice that in these first 6, instinct-driven, safety-driven, power-driven, order-driven, success-driven, and people-driven. Now those words are very carefully used because these are ways in which we have thought in the past, and many are still thinking. This is how we think. But when these intelligences are active within us, that's basically the way of thinking that dominates. And Howard Bloom writes a lot about this in his book called The Lucifer Principle, when he looks at these periods when it was a very, very interesting world, 40,000 to 10,000 years ago and 5,000 years ago, a very, very feudal period, a very, very feudal existence. So there is no country on the planet that's not experienced that, just some got there earlier and sooner rather than others. And Howard Bloom basically looks back at this period of the driven phases of our species and says, look, to achieve a new way forward, to achieve the peace and freedom that I hinted at the start of this conversation, we have to overcome some of the innate aspects of our existence that nature has equipped us with historically that we no longer need. The life conditions today and the world of an abundance where quality of life, rather than fighting for scarce resources, becomes the invitation for us to latch onto today. And that means that in the transition from green to yellow here, you can see a new language. So the functional form, the functionality of this yellow code here, where flexible flow oriented, is the start of the holistic way of thinking that those policymakers in Australia were seeking. The integral organism, synthesis oriented, is the next collective stage where we come together in a new way as a species to really embrace and deal with the tough issues on the planet. So these are the ways of thinking that exist behind historic and future governance forms. And so I'm going to talk about the patterns of what's gone before as well as what's emerging. But I want you to realize also that in the research that's been done here, that this is a significant leap. Claire Graves, whose pioneering research really triggered the whole body of knowledge of integral psychology, really said, look, the data is clear that as a species, we must prepare for a momentous leap. So I'm trusting that our week of celebration as ICF is part of accelerating this momentous leap, where we can step into a world that's waiting to be born, but also handle many of the complex issues that have defeated us so far in handling them and move into a new way of engaging, where we discover that every country has got its own unique contribution to our future existence, not only on this planet, but also in universe. And Graves highlighted the language here, that it's the transition from what he called the first tier, 6 stages of thinking, I'm going to call it the 6 stages of governance, the stages of human doing, to the transition to what is called the second tier ways of thinking, which are called human being. So it's in this transition we do become fully human. We start to leave behind fear. The capacity for fear does not make the transition from green to yellow. And suddenly we find that those emotional cores of anger, fear, and many other emotional cores, frustration, loneliness, and so on and so forth, start to change and morph. And we're no longer driven by those fears and those responses. We move into a place where everything becomes an I choose to. So on the work here, in my work with agriculture, we work with the premise of what's called holistic management. And many farmers will blame the weather. They will say, well, actually it didn't rain, or it too much rain, and everybody tends to be at the mercy of the weather. The holistic worldview doesn't think that way. The holistic worldview says, what do we want? And learns to spot the weak signs of the transition of the journey that's desired and proactively manage towards the future that we really want. So this is a time for everything becomes an I choose to. Now, it means that when we're looking back in at these pictures, we're actually stimulating a more holistic awareness. And the phraseology that came from Don Beck and Chris Karen in their early work around spiral dynamics was that when we look back in, and I've changed some of the words on this slide to reflect the current thinking, but the integral awareness, the more holistic, integral, complete understanding, can look back in and see these patterns and realize that, yes, there are ethical paradoxes, but we can design governance frameworks that can nurture the innocent whilst appreciating the tribes and the spirits in purple, whilst meeting the big boss's demands out of red, according to the one true righteous law, to achieve measurable bottom line results for the greatest potential of all people, whilst learning how Earth systems work and pursuing quality of life, and we act for planetary and species viability. So we're meshing together, stitching together, weaving together a new story for humanity in our conversations around this week with the ICF. And it means that we're learning to awaken a more holistic integral awareness, and everything we're doing around the theoretical aspects of what I'm talking about do one thing. They stimulate that which is often dormant within you, within me, and many people around the planet. And we have to have a bit of insight to be able to perceive and comprehend that we couldn't perceive before. So remember the 6 conditions for failure or problems when we fail to perceive. And so the insights, the new ways of thinking, are supported by the theory. This is not a hypothesis. This is theory. This is proven. You can prove this for yourself. And over time, you can learn the procedures, tools, and metrics that support you on this journey, whilst we learn to fully utilize this new expression of humanness. So it's from this understanding that there are a repertoire of themes of human existence, from the survival sense, through the tribal bond, through the impulse power, through the truth force, through the strive drive, through the human equity, through the holistic flow, through the integral being, remembering that we are not finished. We barely started as a species. Think of this as a transit through adolescence. There's a whole new maturity waiting for us. But the reason we're on this call is because we're learning to handle this gap. Because unless we choose to go and explore and look at this transition that I've highlighted, this transition that Graves called the major leap, we tend to run into difficulties. But this image, I believe, says many things. And one of the things I want to draw out today, the way we organize ourselves at work or the way we govern ourselves, there's how we do it at the moment. And if you look at these images at the top of the screen, you'll start to relate to perhaps governance systems, local or national or international, that you're familiar with. But what we're saying here, here's a chance. In the yellow way, the yellow code here is describing a more holistic awareness. We've got a chance to choose the form of governance that creates the life conditions that releases the flow of humanity in a way that will leave us all breathless. So we'll move beyond the I'm right, you're wrong sort of conversation to working together to shape the life conditions that release human motivational flow and witness significant change in our species at a pace that's never been recorded in history. So I'll give you an example. So most people talk about science, but I want to highlight that when we look at it from this worldview perspective, there's at least 3 different forms of science that we know about. Science 1 really came out of the world of Newton, the reductionist science, and that served us very well. And if I want to build a bridge or build an aircraft, I want to use reductionist scientists, reductionist science. They have mastered and really started to master the engagement of the physical world. We can land satellites on asteroids and time the arrival to within 30 seconds. And that's after 2 years of journey. It's quite remarkable what we can do with the technology. Science 2 is more human-centric, bringing in the inner world, the subjective world that Science 1 tends not to focus on. So action inquiry and the pursuit of action-oriented research is the domain of the transition through green, a much more people-driven, humanistic way of engaging the world. But the scientific basis of our conversation about governance that I want to bring in today is what I would call this more holistically oriented science that starts to understand the significance of how different groups of people coexist across this full spectrum simultaneously, and how we utilize all the different points of view of science to give us the solutions that work today. And remember, the list, the 6th item on my list earlier was that solutions didn't work. I'm after solutions that do work. We need to draw upon everything that we've ever known and seek the truth in those elements and use them to provide a platform as we discover what's new and what's next and what's natural in our conversation. Now, I'm using these images again of the organizing codes and principles to bring out a story. And Dr. Don Beck was really a master in his work on political science. And I was very influenced by his teaching. I was his student from 97 through to about 2004. And I want to bring in some of these conversations that take us into an understanding of how each of these worldview dynamics leads to different political systems and the way in which power gets distributed. And I want to focus on economic systems and how resources get distributed. Because desertification, for example, is just purely about how we handle our resources. So this is the big slide, and I'm going to go through step by step to build up the story and give you some clues. And as you watch this, I want you to be aware of how this relates to you. Where do you see it in your society? How do you respond to it? Does it please you? Does it inspire you? Does it draw you in? Does it irritate you? I want you to be aware of all these factors. None of this is better or worse. These are valid conversations about different perspectives of some people on this planet that we need to understand to equip them and ourselves to create the life conditions so that all can thrive, where thrival is the flow and evolution of our species. So the color code in this beige worldview is beige, okay? And it's a very instinctual way of thinking. So the political system is a survival clan. Small family, 12 to 15 individuals, that's the maximum way of operating. And basically the organizing principle is instinctive. So for example, when they're hungry, they eat. When they're thirsty, they drink. When they're cold, they huddle together, because at that stage, they're often not able of building shelters. A remarkable people. Today, you won't find many out there living a natural existence. You'd have to go into the Sam Bushmen in certain parts of Africa, but they're being infected by more complex thinking year by year. But individuals who are highly attuned and very successful at living in those life conditions. So democracy, there's no concept. It's down to a genetic instinctual response. The political form is a band, and the economic arrangement, basically there's no transaction. Basically it's eat when hungry, and the transaction base, their local economy, is sharing amongst their clan. And they certainly don't worry about possessions, or they don't have any sense of immodesty or modesty around their bodies. Okay, life just is. So purple, the kin spirit stage of development. This is the way of thinking that led to tribes as we know them. It emerged for the first time about 40,000 years ago. You can see the migration of the Aborigines into Australia, for example, and they operated in mobs, as they would call it. But today I can take you to the Andes, and there's still tribes that live at 16,000 feet that have been there quite happily since the 15th century. So it's the tribe, where the governance framework is very much based upon what the tribal elders and the tribal ancestors determine. So democracy, if you use that term in this context, is what our people decide to do as determined by the chief, by the elders, or by the spirits. And if I work in agriculture in Africa, which we do, I have to listen with them to the ancestors, because sometimes the ancestors are informing the people today in Africa to do things or avoid issues on their land that actually are not beneficial. So sometimes we have to help them learn to understand the messages from their ancestors and find new ways. But most importantly, this way of thinking is fundamental to all later governance systems, because here's the basis of all mutual trust and reciprocity and kinship. So in later economic systems, we have to understand this ability to exchange. So Aini is the principle in these indigenous settings, where today I give to you because tomorrow I might need some reciprocity from you to support me through my times of trouble. So the economic arrangement, mutual reciprocity and barter. Okay, and it's often based, the distribution of wealth is based on kinship. Okay, no issues around property ownership, because basically they think collectively, and it's a commons. The members own the commons, and the concept of ownership of land is just beyond their repertoire. So it's a tribal order. And today you probably find this in Haiti. I'm doing work in South Sudan at the moment, North Sudan, and you can find very strong examples. And this slide, this was drawn back in 2003. It still holds true, because large-scale change takes time. So democracy is what our people decide to do, as announced by the chief, the elders, and the spirits. Now, in red, basically feudal empires, whatever the big boss says is the way forward. Power to the people means to the boss and the chosen few. So the big boss and the those that support the boss, and then the rest are left with their begging bowls. So we have feudal empires, and we can look at systems today that are out there, and it's the victors, it's those that win the battle get the spoils, and those that are not in the battle and are not the victors have to pick up the droppings and the spoils from the feasts of the victors. So these are particular political systems that you'll find active in certain parts of the world. And this slide shows here the Taliban, and many of the conversations around what we're seeing in the Middle East is a consequence of these feudal empires closely associated with purple and beige that are finding ways of handling their life conditions in this way, because it's the most appropriate way in a dog-eat-dog world. So every one of these systems is appropriate in their life conditions. Now, the rich get richer, the poor get poorer, and all have to accept that arrangement. So this is why aid gets flown into countries and appears, and the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. This is a domain of what can be quite cunning systems, as cunning determines what happens politically. The next stage is the truth force, the one right way. It's an authoritarian democracy, and it's where the justice and fairness for all, the good people. So this is where there tends to be a class structure and relies on documentation and procedure. Paradoxically, this way of thinking is both the most peaceful and the most warlike. So most of the big conflicts we've seen around the world over the last 100 years have really been based on the battles between these fundamental views that will fight to the death rather than let go of their need to be right, and especially the one right way. But we can see things do change. And in 2003, Cuba was on this slide here, but today it's a very different world. So things do change, and but we can never predict when these changes are going to occur. The basic standard of living will be raised through hard work, discipline, and savings. And obviously it's your duty to pay your fair share to support the system. So this tends to lead to single party rule and classes by birth. So the just, those who are aligned with the one right way, earn the just rewards. So far we can start to see that we're looking into the patterns of a multiplicity of a strata of different democracies, where actually the word democracy can be interpreted and has to be interpreted in very different ways. Because if we project our interpretation of democracy, you have to be clear which interpretation of democracy that you are interpreting and projecting onto the other. So in orange, this is the free market, scientism, commercial, strive, drive, the enterprising self. And this is where you get the dynamics of evidence-based science, and the incentives and the spoils go to the winners. So this is it can be quite a manipulative way of governing, and the skill or the whole democratic framework is to set up to help individuals win the game, measured through economic status typically, and the accumulation of materialistic wealth. Each acts in terms of resource distribution, each acts on their own behalf to prosper. Now, just notice also, so far, has there been any mention of the environment? There is no capacity to think about the environment in any of the stages that I've spoken about before. But here we have the signature of multi-party democracy, the political systems that are there to support the overarching science-based understanding of how we organize our societies. So today around COVID, we can see that nobody stands up and offers any information without providing evidence-based science as to their justification for the way forward, even though what is true today may not be true tomorrow. It's a free market process, which is the story that's told. This is the theme, where the invisible hand of the economy sets pay, price, and perks. Individuals are free to build wealth and status. So this is where the multi-party states occurred, and this is where today, in times of change and transition, you get many parties starting to emerge and materialize, because there are those that are totally aligned with this way of operating. But equally, there are individuals who are looking up to the next stage, which I'm going to talk about, a more humanistic view, where we need to bring in more conversations about the people. Or there may be others who are bringing in political parties that want to take us back to the way things were, because they believe that the past way of thinking is far better for us than the one that we've got at the moment. All are misperceptions of the reality, because the perception of the reality is that each of these worldviews coexist side by side, each with their own demographics. Unless we understand that, we're going to continue to run into problems where we have the satisfied and the dissatisfied. And certainly we're finding today, if one looks at America and one looks at the UK, we're finding polarities, equal numbers of people just voting and balloting in both directions. And we suddenly find their current form of democracy is teetering on a seesaw. Because democracy in green is where everyone shares equally in making consensus-based decisions. It's interesting to make a consensual-based decision when you've got a population in tens of millions. So small countries have a much better advantage in learning how to do that than the larger countries, 60, 300, 180, 100, 120 million in Japan and so on. Small countries have certainly got the advantage at the moment. It's very communitarian as a political form. Social democracy, equal rights, and distribution of wealth equally to all those who deserve. Now you can start to see how that conversation would be like red rag to a bull to someone coming out of an enterprising self perspective. So we can start to see that different worldviews result in different different political parties. So when we go forward and understand the political form in any country, we need to understand which worldview is behind that particular political form, because that will shape, you can predict how they will organize and distribute power, and secondly, how they will distribute and manage resources. So social democracy, the Scandinavian countries, the conversations around the Nordic secrets at the moment are all part of this conversation of the emergence of this green, very egalitarian, sociocentric way of thinking. Now, still no mention of nature or importance of the ecology in the conversation so far. Because the bulk of our species' existence and conversations so far have been how to look after ourselves, physically, meet basic needs from a beige perspective, make sure we've got trust and respect in our cultures from a purple-red perspective, to make sure we have the ability to support the early stages of our emergence of our spiritual selves, to subordinate to a power greater than ourselves, to allow our enterprising selves to develop materialistic solutions that improve quality of life, but also it creates unintended consequences. And then we have to have an inner conversation within ourselves where we have to take stock of the hidden aspects of our humanness to discover that if we try and fix the problems from green, that we can't handle any of the problems that have been created by the earlier forms. So what's next? Where am I going in this conversation? I'm going into the story of what's struggling to emerge. Some would write books that would say, A World Waiting to be Born. There's many books with that title, and I won't quote one, because I'm interested in you contributing your own interpretation of what I'm going to say here. And this is in the minds of many individuals. You just need to learn to go and find them. And what we're talking about here is a more holistic towards integral perspective. It's where we realize that when we look back in at the flow of all these stages, we realize that a stratified democracy, one that understands that all these worldviews and political governance systems coexist together, and that we have to handle resource distribution to meet those needs whilst handling the distribution of wealth to look after the viability, not only of the planet, but the viability of our species. Integrated structures, stratified systems. Now, it's using the word spiral intelligence here because this slide was drawn out of the world of spiral dynamics, but basically today we would call this an understanding of the holistic nisus, the innate intelligence of how life adapts and responds to change in a way that's designed to create a creative form of evolution or emergence. In practical terms, we're seeing that this is a worldview that realizes that we have to perhaps have different forms of political engagement and governance to support a higher quality of being that's focused on quality of all life, not just my life, rather than focusing on the very singular solutions that each of these earlier forms would pursue. Everything contributes to the continued health of our species. Now, a slight error on this slide. I'm not sure if that's an error. Yes, it is. Okay. So the last one is the color code in spiral dynamics. I'm using the color codes of spiral dynamics is turquoise. And this is the one that's most emergent. It's still forming. But basically what this is saying that if individuals in the transition to a more holistic awareness, they will discover things that they then come together in collective forms, in groups, perhaps in new political parties that won't call themselves political parties, but individuals who choose to take the risk and have the courage to design the way forward that meets the needs of all life, all people, all life forms on this planet. It means that we're moving into a more holonic democracy, where not just an appreciation of each of the stages is brought into the conversation, but we truly step in to the appreciation that there is no separation between any one of us, between any nation. We are one living organism with distinct representations, distinct intelligences, and we all have a significant contribution to make to the continuance of life on this planet. And arguably, if we look at the way things are going, we can then learn to assume our role in the universe. We're far bigger than our role here on Earth, but Earth is home and we are an expression of that planet. And so the holistic thinking, the holistic governance frameworks, the more holistic integral conversation today basically look at whole world issues and releases creativity to resolve those issues in a way that reflects the specific life conditions and the needs of individuals in that context, but from a meta perspective. So Earth's resources and the learning needs, the information needs are distributed by need and capability, not by want. And that's an interesting statement, because much of the information in the wrong hands can actually turn into significant weapons of mass destruction. We have to be careful of that. The technology of the enterprising orange in the hands of a very strong purple, red, blue dynamic means that you can have weapons of mass destruction in the hands of those who do not have a moral compass that would prevent them doing harm. And we've seen many complex situations around the planet supporting that at the moment. So I've outlined a story and a map, and I just want to remind you that nothing I'm saying here is finite or finished. We are barely through the adolescence phase of our species. We're learning to take full responsibility for ourselves, each other, our planet, and our role in the universe, which I think is a very important story. So Mount Ararat is calling, because for me, Mount Ararat brings in this bigger story. It's an inspiration, a beacon. And I found it interesting when I looked at the profile of Mount Ararat, and Nana just drew my attention to the fact that when we look at the distribution of each of these worldviews across the planet, and this is roughly the same profile here. So if we look across the world, it's roughly a beige, purple, red dynamic that live a certain fourth world existence. And you can see the different strata, the third world existence, the second world, and the first world. And we can start to see that there are bulges of different worldview combinations that mean different forms of governance are needed depending upon the ratios of the worldviews that are active in those situations. So if we send aid out of a very wealthy orange-green stage and put it back in, take the aid into a beige, purple, red world with a tinge of blue, very often it makes the whole situation a whole lot worse, because the individuals in that orange-green capability, those orange-green worldviews, cannot comprehend the necessary governmental or political forms that are needed to handle that complexity. So it's interesting looking around the world at the moment. So, for example, the one that's in my mind at the moment is the withdrawal of the US troops from Afghanistan. The demand for the withdrawal of the US troops from Afghanistan is coming out of this domain here. And the life conditions in Afghanistan are somewhere in this domain here. See how you can use this image? Now, as you think about Armenia, where's Armenia on this continuum? And perhaps, Nana, one of the things after this conversation is that this would be a useful image to give people access to through the video, and they can just take a screenshot of it. But the question might be, where's the distribution of thinking in Armenia? And what is it that's leading to this conversation that leads me to be here today? Because this conversation is not normal. This conversation is invited, and it's normally a reflection of the change that's already happening in the culture, where individuals like Nana and other colleagues who she's working with know that there is a new way forward, if only we could work out how to handle this transition, whilst we also handle some of the issues that we have as a country internally, as a country with our neighbours, and how do we provide appropriate governance and resource distribution formulas and economic systems that create the life conditions that equip us to shine like a beacon and lead a way forward. Because Armenia's done that before. A country that first adopted Christianity as an early adopter is a country that's probably equipped and ready to make the next transition to what's next naturally before other countries. Who knows? Perhaps that's the invitation that I offer you from today. What I do know is that holistically oriented science is out there. It's been emerging since the 1920s, and it's something that I track as part of my work. And this work by this mathematician, Arthur Young, a very formidable mathematician who designed the first Bell helicopter from his understanding of complex adaptive systems, wrote this in the 1970s. The universe is a theatre of increasingly complex organisation, in which man has a definite place without any upper limit to his evolution. And there is a truth in that. We're barely out of our phase of adolescence, and according to the research, these stages of development, if we have 8 that are the dominant on the planet at the moment, we have the capacity as a species for between 18 to 24 before there's any need for any genetic or biological change to our intelligence handling capabilities. So I offer this story with great hope and optimism that, yes, it might appear to be complex in my conversation with you, but certainly what I'm doing, I hope, is respond to the weak signals, the whispers or the invitations from Mount Ararat that's inviting you to become inspired to just go that half a step beyond anything you've ever considered before, to look back in, to really consider, can we really perceive this situation? Is our thinking open to the changes that are essential? Are the solutions that we're offering really effective and working? I can summarize the words of Jared Diamond into those 3 points. That for me is the invitation that we're responding to in our conversation today. And I thank you for giving me the privilege of offering this little talk to you today. And I'm very grateful to Nana for inviting me. Thank you, Nana.
Thank you, Christopher. And do we have some time for questions?
You do.
Excellent, thank you very much. So what you say is all those orders and patterns are coping systems.
Yes.
This is how we respond to a situation, and that's how the evolution happens somehow, because we meet certain situations and problems that cannot be solved from within this coping system, and that's why we find another way, a new way that has not been created yet to cope with this.
Yes. So, so I've put on the screen just something for people to read and ponder whilst we're having the conversation, because they could start to test out the validity of what we're talking about here for themselves. And what we're saying, remember the 5 deep story, that by the time you and I come to have a conversation and we're thinking and holding that cognitive capability to have that conversation, where our thinking is shaped by complex adaptive systems within us that shape how we think, that then leads to the patterns and themes of what we think. So the themes and patterns of what we think are on this slide here for those of you on a device big enough to read them. And what I'm saying also is that the research is clearly showing, and I've been working with this now for nearly 30 years, I've not yet found any deviation from the reliability of the research. We've added to the distinctions and the understanding of yellow turquoise because it's much more prevalent now than it was when the research was done through to 1996. So there have been some additions, but fundamentally the primary principles are sound. So you will find that you can look out into any history book or any newspaper or listen to the news, and you will start to observe these patterns of the deep processes of human change and thinking. And each of them shapes different governance systems and resource allocation and economic systems. And what I'm offering here is that from purple onwards, the economic systems are all derived from the original principle in purple of reciprocity, and then different currencies and different expressions, different totems of exchange are being used throughout the ages. So today we have Bitcoin that's emerging. Who knows if that's going to be the basis of currency that takes us into the new era? I tend not to think so. I see it more of a last-ditch attempt to fix the old system without really changing anything in this orange-green transition. So it's a really exciting time. I can talk all day, and I'll be quiet now and wait for the next question.
You also say that governmental systems are reflections of how we think.
Yes.
And you also say that in yellow, and let me know if I am correct, that it is kind of an inclusive pattern which you can find the distribution of all the patterns.
That's right. Yeah.
Holistically.
So the capacity to be able to accept and comprehend and work with the full spectrum of worldviews that I'm showing on the screen at the moment are a reflection of a capacity that emerges in that transition from green to yellow, okay, in that journey, okay. And so when I invite you to look at this multiplicity of worldviews simultaneously, you're looking at the pattern of our whole species on one slide. And the capacity to do that and do it in a way that recognizes these patterns as part of a flow of the emergence of our species is first emerges and can be develop governance systems from yellow onwards. Now we have to remember, Nana, that we're working with a fundamental understanding of how nature functions. This patterning and this ability for new life to beget new life is a fundamental pattern of all existence that's occurred over the last 14 billion years. So in our thinking here today, we start with universe, and these are the patterns of the human psyche. But I can take these patterns of different life forms having different capacities to handle different levels of complexity, and as I say, I can look out onto my farmland here and I can see rocks down here with lichen on it. That's the first basic algae and lichee, which is the first basic life form that emerged on the planet. And then different plants evolved over time. So in ecology, you would end up with a mapping of different stages of different species that have evolved over time. And today, the highest level I can see out of the window here is a mixed forest. And that's basically the highest expression that the natural world has achieved so far. Doesn't mean to say it's the end, just means to say that that's the highest expression so far. So we as a species can look back in, and Arthur Young called it the reflexive universe. We are able to look back in at the universe and provide information and understanding that the universe probably has never been aware of at any stage in its past.
Mm-hmm. And I'm following my question thread. I do understand that, I mean, the only way is the evolution and not a revolution. And at the same time, I have heard you saying, and also meaning this gap that you have showed before the yellow. I have heard you saying earlier during your training that the red, the yellow is a new beige.
Okay, so I'm trying to avoid.
What's the key?
What's the key? Okay, so this is not just about worldviews per se. It's an understanding of how our neurobiology and neurochemistry carries and shapes and influences our worldviews and vice versa. And that then leads to culture. And that's when the collective come together to agree that something is good, which is a moral-based judgment. And then when it's good and they want to repeat it, they build social systems. So what we're dealing with here is a bio-psycho-cultural social systems perspective of human emergence. Now, what you're linking to is some of the understanding that the neurochemistry and what changes in the mind from green to yellow is quite remarkable. Because in that transition, earlier deep brain structures and processes that were primarily in our species and supporting beige, those neurochemical biological structures become reused and linked to the higher order functions of the brain in completely new ways. And that's been tracked both through changes in neurochemistry, and a change in neurochemistry occurs across every one of these stages. So we track it in societies by the use of recreational drugs. Alcohol is the recreational drug of choice of blue. Cocaine is the recreational drug of choice of orange. The cannabises and the grass, the weed is the recreational drug of choice of green. Why? Because those particular substances map totally onto the neurochemical receptors of the biochemistry of the individual. So in the transition into yellow, yes, it's a significant leap. We don't know what the recreational drug for choice of yellow is. Yellow tends to be wiser than that. But one of the good signatures that you map into that transition into yellow is that the individual, the way their senses function changes. They have a much higher spectrum of sensory capability. The sensory capability of beige is very refined, very, very expansive. And it seems to re-emerge again at that level of intensity into yellow. And this is clearly one of the challenges for us now with children with autism and so on and so forth, because the autistic learning style is the learning style of yellow, and the learning style of beige is also autistic. So way learning styles change, neurochemical changes, and emotional issues, fear, for example, we lose the capacity for freeze fear in the transition into yellow. Those are just some of the things that we know about this transition.
Yeah, I was thinking if there is a short way, kind of, if there is a way of changing, for example, directly from beige to yellow, if beige. If yellow is new beige, then
No.
what might be that one thing
that transition
makes
okay.
the change?
The simple answer is that for an individual making the transition from orange through green, they have access, that their being and their neurochemical frameworks as well as their personality has been shaped by the transition through all the earlier stages. And remember, I used the slide right at the beginning of the presentation where we're talking about life conditions may shape the thinking, or thinking may shape the life conditions. Remember, there's the planet and the nested hierarchy of psychological space. So what we know is you create the life conditions that stimulate and release latent holistic awareness. And that tends to be anything that stimulates process awareness, especially process awareness around nature. So our work here in agriculture, we're doing it because we want to create the life conditions to release latent capacities that are dormant in this industry. Because the emergence of more holistic thinking is often innate and inarticulate in a farmer, because they have very close contact with the land, very close to contact with the animals. They're very highly sensitive in their senses. And how do you release that? You release it by bringing in the cognitive awareness, new insights, help them be more successful, more economically viable, to be ecologically successful, which is unheard of in the domain of agriculture, and also to be culturally engaged and trusted and respected. That's how you create the life conditions to support that transition to yellow. It's not possible to bypass any one of the earlier stages. You can't go straight from beige to yellow. You have to understand that the journey, it can be very compressed in the early stages. So the first 7 years of life of a child, so far it may get shorter. The first 7 years has really been the transition from beige through purple to the early stage formation of red. And then after that, there's very speedy transitions, whilst the child is equipped to be just half a step ahead of the life conditions created by the parents. So nature's really smart. It always builds in a dynamic tension. So you've got children. I mean, there will be times when it's all love and enjoyment, but there'll be times when there's dynamic tension, when they're asking the questions and testing out the boundaries. And that's how nature functions, by creating tensions between two life forms and seeing how those life forms interact. Because when those life forms can interact successfully, it may lead to a stimulation of new growth and new capability. So in agriculture here, when the cow meets the grass, it's exactly the same dynamic. It's the interaction between the cow and the grass, when managed appropriately from a more holistic awareness, that leads to the stimulation in animal health, productivity of the grassland, and also the health of the consumer that enjoys the milk or enjoys the meat products. See how it works?
Yeah. Can you bring some examples of governmental systems? I mean, old or new or current, that would represent all those patterns?
Well,
or it can be organizations as well, because this theory well fits to organizational development as well.
Well, the best way I would do that is to say, well, let me put this slide up, and you know, we've got some people listening to this, and let's work with you. So remember that we can use this to scan and read any situation. So I'm going to ask you, you're the only person I can speak to on this class, so let's ask you. So if you think about Armenia and the governance of Armenia at the moment, what is the center of gravity of the current political system? Which are you tend to find 2 or 3 next to each other, but I want to focus on 2 of these worldview systems next to each other that would describe the political center of gravity of your country.
I'd say red.
Okay. And what's happening in the life conditions that might be stimulating that?
I would mention not only life conditions within the country, but also, I mean, the situation in the region that somehow, I mean, if we think from that perspective, then it's also, it could be even bad, because
Okay.
sometimes it's a survival things that we kind of need to cope with.
Okay, so so what I can hear from this conversation is there's lots of pressure on Armenia as a country.
Yeah, and at the same time, you can see, I mean, amazing sports. I mean, champions in chess, or best educational institution, or a school, or I mean, amazing companies that are leaders in the world in IT. So this is a really interesting situation when I would say they are close to each other.
Okay.
In terms of patterns.
Okay, so what I'm hearing is, when I listen to you, I hear a situation where, because of issues that haven't yet been resolved, that for some it can be a bit of a dog-eat-dog situation. You need to be tough to be able to survive in those situations. But generally, your country is a country. What I'm hearing from what you say, your country is a country that's got a lot of capacity. So really, I'm hearing a really an orange-green, a blue-orange-green dynamic. But the life conditions are forcing you to occasionally look back at really basic needs, how to beige, and also having to fight tooth and nail to survive in a very unforgiving world.
One more aspect I wanted to mention, diaspora, which, I mean, the connections are really strong, and those come from very different spots. And I guess from very different places where the patterns are really different. So somehow it looks like a unique situation. I mean, for me, it looks like a unique situation when I look at those codes. Looks like we have everything. We have the full spectrum.
Yeah, you have the full spectrum, but you'll tend to find politically, in terms of a governance system, it will either be a multi-party democracy, so very much an
In
orange.
terms of political system, I wouldn't say it is multi-party right now.
And there'll be some who are really looking for equality, and so there'll be some parties out there that are looking for peace, equality. Perhaps the Green Party. I don't know how you describe them in Armenia. Are they small?
Yep.
Yeah. But what isn't there, and what I think your hope is around this conversation, is that the ability to realize there's a whole strata of political responses. The question is, from a more holistic perspective, is how to utilize those political spectrums, not only to deal with the external, what's going on around the edges of the country, but also how to bring a new quality of life to all internal issues. Now, I've studied this quite a bit, and I lived in Thailand back in '93 through to 1996. And I became fascinated by countries that had been able to successfully live peacefully with their neighbors and over many, many years. And I listened closely as to how countries that had been caught in the crossfire handled these situations. They had three governments. They had one government that looked after the Allies, they had one government that looked after the Japanese, and they had one government that looked after their internal affairs. So what this conversation and what this stimulus of ideas, and it does require a bit more thinking to get through to the application. What I'm really inviting anyone who's listening to this, where Armenia is the focus of the conversation, is to recognize that there is certain hope in an uncertain ways, in an uncertain world, to come up with new solutions that have a chance of overcoming some of the barriers to progress that you have experienced so far. Now, peace and freedom is where I started the talk today. Now, I'm not just talking about peace occurring. To have peace, you sometimes, for the next few years, you'll need some teeth to be able to reinforce it. The Swiss know this. The Swedes know this. The neutral countries know that they can be declared as neutral, but they need to be able to protect themselves. But they will enforce it. But they enforce it with such precision and with such a capability that it encourages any third party to consider it very carefully. So, in the UK, Brexit politically has left us with a dynamic of polarity between the Conservatives, which are really a blue-orange, a red-blue-orange dynamic, up against an orange-green dynamic, a more social-centric. The same in America, the Democrats and the Republicans. The Republicans really a red-blue-orange dynamic, the Democrats a blue-orange-green dynamic. Very little difference when it all comes down to it, but they will fight to the death to retain their power. So this is where we've got to consider the nature of future politics, because it's not about the party. It's not about the individual or the leader. It's about having those who are competent to lead and help organize and facilitate solutions that release a country through its current and future issues. So at the moment, we're right on the edge, right on the cusp of discovering what new forms of governance mean. But to make that transition will mean that many things that we believe to be true will have to be reconsidered. Now, if we go back to history and look at the Renaissance and the transition, where really the church separated from the state. I've never spoken about this public before, but for you, I believe it's important. We're going to see a separation of conventional science from the state, because at the moment, many conventional scientific support frameworks are actually causing politicians to make decisions that are not in the nation's interest. And that's a hard thing to say, but it is true. We need to allow those who are competent to lead in a way that truly serves their people and the full spectrum of all the thinking that exists in their countries, with full regard to their role in a global position, as well as their role in managing the resources on the planet. That's the space I think this conversation is designed to release, to allow a new niche, a new space to emerge. And I suspect that many listening to this conversation will be saying, well, I've been thinking about this for many years, but I just thought it was me. And suddenly now they can start to have a conversation with others, and that can lead to more informed choices and more informed decisions that do truly lead to a new way forward. So I'm very hopeful and very certain that we're on that cusp. So I've given you examples of the UK, of the USA. I've touched upon Switzerland. I've touched upon Sweden. But the issue is not to copy what any other country is doing. Every country has got its own unique signature, its own unique cultural, cultural tone, cultural song, let's call it that. The skill is to find out what is the new song of your country, of every country, because it's that, and the national pride will carry through that country, not in isolation from all others, but with full appreciation of all others. And if there's boundaries and lines of the sand to be drawn, they will have to be drawn and they will have to be respected.
We have two questions, if you have a few more minutes.
Yep.
Anush Manicharan is asking, thank you so much. And how do we engage the broader public in the conversation and create awareness about these phases? Is there a way?
There is a way, and certainly I'd defer that question to Nana in terms of, I'm hoping that inspired individuals like Nana and others will take on the responsibility for making sure these stories and this knowledge is available to those who are seeking it in Armenia or whichever location that you're listening to. And certainly it's a body of knowledge that is self-verifiable, it's very robust, and obviously as our species evolves, so we'll need to pick up the new patterns. But there's plenty for us to do, from the soil to the stomach to the soul. And over to you, Nana. What are your plans?
We'll see what's emerging.
Yeah, that wasn't.
I very much hope that that people will be interested and will start joining the conversation.
Yeah, if there's an interest, it means that the change has already happened and we're learning to grow into it, and that's all of us. This is not about putting another tool in your toolkit as a coach. It's not about finding another way of selling your services more effectively. This is really about together taking time to press the pause button while we come up with new ways of perceiving and engaging the world and discovering what our niche is in the next phase. One of the niches I've chosen is in agriculture because it's by far the most complex sector on the planet. And as we work around the world with that, it's really a demonstration of everything I'm talking about on this conversation. But it's an invitation for us all to find our new niches. And certainly for me, I've got great interest in holistically oriented policy setting. So perhaps one of the ways to engage, not just in education and training, is to find a particular topic or issue where we can demonstrate the efficacy of the application of a more holistically oriented approach. So the person who asked the question, you may well have an idea of a topic or an issue that could be usefully explored. The more real we make it, the more relevant we make it, the faster the adoption, and the more elegant and surprising are the solutions.
Thank you for your answer. And one more from Lilith Asatra. From your opinion, which may be the upcoming ninth wave, how it may look like?
Is the upcoming
ninth wave? I don't know. I think probably she's talking about coral, Lilith.
Well, it means if we get to the ninth wave, it means that life on Earth has got pretty desperate. It means that we've taken too long, you, me, and everyone on this call, to respond to the current situation. Because remember that the emergence of each level of new thinking is a consequence of our inability to cope with our life conditions. The life conditions in turquoise are when the viability, the existence of our planet is threatened by a significant issue. Now, in the research in the 1960s and 70s, the sort of issue that was considered was a significant meteorite hitting the Earth. And there's one called the meteorite or asteroid Tortatus, which is planned to come close or get very close to us in 2069. So it's something that threatens all life on Earth. Now, coral, which is the ninth level, may well come about because it's not an external factor that creates the mass issues for us on the planet that we have to deal with. It will be something that means we have to act very urgently and very fast, because otherwise we see the elimination of the human species on the planet. And that could come from many sources. It could be a biological weapon of mass destruction in the hands of those that really have no moral compass in terms of its application. So to answer your question, what are the life conditions that would be more severe than the threat of the loss of life to the whole planet happening in very short order? That may well be the life conditions that stimulate the ninth level. It's one of the reasons I was very interested in the 30-year drought in Australia, because one of the things that we know is that for the emergence of new thinking to occur, the life conditions have to be changing and becoming progressively worse over the long run of time. There's no doubt I find brilliant innovators in Australia thinking very differently. But that 30-year drought really polished and refined what today I would call the more holistically oriented thinker. But their solutions and their capabilities are still today not generally accepted in the mainstream, even though their solutions completely outperform the present paradigm by any metric. So if we get to the emergence of the 9th level, it means that life conditions on this planet will have got pretty messy. But the good news is that if the 9th level does start to emerge, it means we're still capable to evolve and emerge, which could well be another issue that we've got to face up to, is that perhaps there's some chemical or some issue that's released in the environment that removes our capability to continue our evolution. So that's a big question you ask around that 9th level.
We basically have one more question that I promise is going to be the last one. Mariana Puloyan is asking, and it is from your slide, why do some societies and organizations make disastrous decisions? What is the coping system, or what is possible to do if we have these disastrous values, the 4th one, in the society?
Okay, can you just repeat that again, because there's a terrible echo and I missed a lot of it. Just say it again slowly, Nana, please. I want to make sure I've got the message.
Yeah. So what Mariana is asking, can you hear me well?
I can hear. So I can hear the name now. So it's Mariana. Hi, Mariana.
Yeah. Why do some societies and organizations make this disastrous decision? This is from that slide that you shared.
Okay.
And there were 6 reasons. And she's asking what we can do if we see that we have this disastrous values issue in the society.
Okay. Well, very often the answer to that question is by considering all 6 factors here simultaneously and coming up with the antidote. So in the understanding of how human emergence functions, there are 6 conditions that we need to meet to support the emergence of new thinking that can handle the complexity. So if it's failure to anticipate a problem, it's learning to anticipate and understand the natural successional dynamics around a problem. So when we're dealing with succession and human emergence, and we're dealing with a problem, it normally means we can predict what's next naturally and how to overcome that problem through that anticipation. The failure to perceive may well mean that the individual is totally blinkered and driven by their own way of thinking. They can't see anything else. And so the way around that is to make sure that you expand their awareness or encourage them to seek help from those who can perceive and see the way forward. The bad behavior is often driven through fears and concerns. And the one to watch out for is the fear of shame and the fear of blame. Now, disastrous values means that very often it's one of the driven intelligences within us that's pursuing to do something and ignoring the evidence of it not, of not being good for us. So that's one of the characteristics, let's call it psychological addiction. So as coaches, there are many ways in which we can understand the value dynamics, the coping systems. But what you need to know as a coach or in your practice is that it doesn't matter how disastrous the values are, they are temporary and may change over time if only you understand how to create the life conditions where that individual is in much more thrival. And all of these 6 are all down to how the individual or the collective makes decisions. And it means that the more we can expand awareness to stretch conversations of politicians, of scientists, of teachers, and so on, of coaches into a new space, to stretch into this new space, and then allow them to come back to their own life conditions, they will never be able ever to go back to the way they were before. And that's what leads to the difference between unsuccessful solutions being repeated time after time after time, and new solutions that overcome the barriers being developed where individuals have the courage to go out and experiment, knowing that there are new ways of navigating into the future that are not used in conventional policymaking, science, or any other form of governance at the moment. We call them leading indicators. All of our societies focus on rear view mirror lagging indicators, which can be useful, but I'm more interested, and we're more interested about what's next naturally, and how do we release the natural motivational flow for us to get there. That's a whole new metric base, which we call leading indicators.
Thank you, Christopher. Thank you so much for this presentation and for this webinar. And as you said in the beginning, that all the answers are inside. And I kept asking the question, so what's the key? And I somehow recall your saying that the difference between the first octave, I would say, and the second, starting from yellow, is human versus fear, probably. Yes. And that, and probably if, hopefully, when Armenians join around human and around mission, there might be this shift, and hopefully we will have it. And probably Armenia is going to be that country, because of facing so many complex issues and problems. I mean, that new model is going to emerge somewhere in the world, and hopefully, basically, because we are facing those issues that are so complex, that probably it is here that this will happen. And I mean, thank you so much for the whole webinar, especially for what you started with. That might be that mission, that might become that mission Ararat is calling.
Yeah. Well, one thing that comes to mind as you speak, Nana, is that perhaps, and I've said this to individuals who are looking at the future of Scotland, okay? In the lead up to Scottish independence in the UK back in 97, 98, a group were asked to go and lead the Second Enlightenment in Scotland. And they spoke to me 10 years into the program, and they said, well, it doesn't seem to be working too well, what can we do? And I just said, there's one very simple thing you need to do. You need to understand what were the root dynamics, the root causes of the first Enlightenment, because only when you understand that can you understand anything about what might be called the Second Enlightenment. So as I close today, I'm left with the thought, as I listen to you speak, that perhaps if we understand what it was that led Armenia to adopt Christianity as the first nation to do that, in that there may well be some clues to the early adoption of a new way forward that creates a new beacon of hope on this planet. And I believe that there's some truth in what I'm saying there. And it's not to copy it, but it's to learn from it, to open our minds to the inspiration and the very spiritual dimensions that would have accompanied that. But I'm talking about the spiritual dimensions of a transition to a more holistic awareness that are very different to the spiritual aspirations that led to the adoption of Christianity. But there will be some parallels and there will be some patterns from which we can learn. So thank you so much. This has been a treat for me to be able to talk on this topic.
Thank you, Christopher. And hopefully, while you're closing the webinar, a new conversation is opening in Armenia.
I hope so too. It looks beautiful from this photograph. My only concern was that I got the mountain the right way round to make sure the photograph was coming from Armenia.
I hope you see it in person.
I hope so too. Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you. Thank you for this opportunity.
Invitation.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
And thank you for all who have attended the meeting. Bye-bye.
Yes, thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.